The fog rolled off the Tennessee River like something alive, thick enough to choke on. Private James Hutchins crouched behind a fallen oak, his rifle trembling in hands that had forgotten how to be steady. 3 days since the battle at Shiloh, and the woods still reeked of death, a sweet, putrid smell that clung to the inside of his nostrils and made every breath a reminder of mortality. "You hear that?" whispered Thomas Webb, pressed against the same tree. His face was gaunt, eyes hollowed by things no 19-year-old should see. James listened. Through the mist came sounds that didn't belong. Not quite footsteps, but a dragging, scraping noise, accompanied by wet breathing that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Probably just hogs," James said, not believing it. "Feeding on the dead." They'd been separated from their unit during a Confederate counterattack, lost in these cursed woods for 2 days now. The battle had been chaos, screaming men, thundering artillery, blood turning the earth to crimson mud. General Grant's forces had held barely, but at a cost that staggered the mind. Thousands dead on both sides, left where they fell, while both armies regrouped and licked their wounds. The scraping sound grew closer. "That ain't no hog," Thomas breathed. Through the fog, a shape emerged. At first, James thought it was a soldier, wounded and crawling. But as it came closer, his mind struggled to make sense of what he was seeing. It was a man, had been a man, in the tattered remains of a Confederate uniform. But he moved wrong, joints bending at angles that made James's stomach turn. The soldier's face was grey as ash, eyes milky white, and where his jaw should have been was just a mass of exposed bone and hanging flesh. The thing hadn't been shot. It looked like it had been partially eaten. "Sweet Jesus," Thomas whispered, raising his rifle. The corpse thing turned toward the sound, moving with unnatural speed. Its mouth opened in a silent scream, revealing a black throat that seemed to descend into infinite darkness. Thomas fired, the crack of the rifle deafening in the still air. The bullet struck center mass, punching through the creature's chest. But it didn't stop. It didn't even slow. "Run!" James screamed. They crashed through the undergrowth, branches clawing at their faces. Behind them, the thing pursued, and now James could hear others. That same dragging, scraping sound, multiplying, coming from all directions. How many men had died here? 10,000, 20. Thomas tripped over a root, went sprawling. James grabbed his arm, hauling him up. And that's when he saw them. Dozens of figures emerging from the fog, all moving with that same wrong, broken puppet motion. Blue uniforms and grey, Union and Confederate, united now in death. They ran until James's lungs burned, until his legs were rubber, until the sounds of pursuit finally faded. They collapsed in a small clearing, gasping for air, and as the adrenaline drained away, James began to shake uncontrollably. What were those things? Thomas managed. James had no answer. In his 23 years, he'd been taught that the dead stayed dead, that God kept natural order, that the world made sense. All those certainties had just been torn away. As darkness fell, they huddled together, too terrified to sleep. And in the distance, they heard other sounds. Screams of men who weren't dead yet, cut short with sickening abruptness. Whatever walked these woods was still hunting. When dawn finally came, grey and cheerless, they moved cautiously through the forest. The fog had lifted enough to reveal the true horror of the battlefield. Bodies lay everywhere, twisted in their final agonies, but many of them looked wrong. torn apart, but not by bullets or bayonets. Teeth marks scored exposed flesh. Some corpses had been hollowed out, ribs cracked open like cellar doors. "We need to find the army," James said. "Warn them." "Warn them about what?" "That the dead are walking. They'll think we've lost our minds." A branch snapped behind them. They spun, rifles raised. But what emerged from the tree line wasn't one of the creatures. It was a man, alive, in a Union officer's uniform, though it was torn and blood-stained. He was tall, thin to the point of emaciation, with intense dark eyes that seemed to bore into James's soul. "Lower your weapons," the officer said, his voice oddly accented. "You're safe now, for the moment." "Who are you?" James demanded. "Captain Matthias Crow, late of the 15th Ohio." He moved closer, studying them with disturbing intensity. "You've seen them, haven't you? The hollow men." "The what?" "That's what I call them. Bodies animated by something unnatural. I've been tracking this phenomenon for 3 days now, ever since the battle." Crow pulled out a small journal, its pages covered in cramped handwriting and strange symbols. "The question that should concern us is not what they are, but what made them." Thomas lowered his rifle slightly. "You're saying something caused this on purpose?" "Look around you, boy. Thousands of men died here in 2 days. Violent deaths. Deaths filled with pain and terror and rage. That much anguish, that much spilled blood. It tears holes in the world. Opens doors that should stay closed." Crow's eyes gleamed with something that might have been madness or might have been terrible knowledge. Something came through, something old and hungry. James wanted to dismiss this as the ravings of a lunatic, but after what he'd seen, he couldn't. "How do we stop it?" "Stop it?" Crow laughed, a sound without humor. "You don't understand. This is just the beginning. There's going to be 3 more years of this war, minimum. Hundreds of thousands more dead. Every battlefield will be a feeding ground. By the time this conflict ends, there won't be enough living left to bury the dead." "Then what do we do?" Crow was silent, for a long moment, staring at something only he could see. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "We survive. We bear witness, and we try to save who we can." He looked at them directly. "I'm gathering men, soldiers who've seen the truth, who are willing to fight a different kind of war, a secret war in the shadows of the greater conflict. Interested?" James thought of running, of trying to find his unit and pretend none of this had happened. But he knew it was impossible. He'd seen what walked in these woods. If Crow was right, if this was happening everywhere. "I'm in," he said. Thomas, after a moment's hesitation, nodded. "Good." Crow pulled out a map, spreading it on a fallen log. "There's a field hospital 3 miles north. Started yesterday. They've been reporting strange incidents. Wounded men dying and rising again. Doctors disappearing. If we move fast, we might be able to contain it before it spreads beyond the hospital grounds." They moved through the forest in grim silence, Crow leading the way, with the confidence of a man who'd walked this path before. James noticed things he'd missed before, strange marks carved into tree trunks, symbols that hurt to look at too long, arrangements of bones that seemed almost deliberate. "Captain," Thomas said quietly, "you said something came through. What did you mean?" "Have you ever heard of the Wendigo?" Crow asked. "Native legends speak of a spirit of hunger, of endless consumption. It possesses men, drives them to cannibalism, makes them into monsters. The tribes who lived here before us, they knew things we've forgotten. They knew that certain places are thin spots, where the barrier between our world and other places grows weak. You're saying an Indian spirit did this. I'm saying the tribes understood something we don't. That death and violence have power. That belief and fear can make things real. The Wendigo is one name for it. Other cultures have other names. But the principle is the same. Where death feeds death, where the boundary between life and the grave becomes blurred, things slip through the cracks. They crested a ridge and the field hospital came into view. It had been set up in a church and the surrounding grounds, white tents arranged in neat rows. But something was wrong. Too quiet. No sounds of men in pain, no surgeons calling for instruments. Just silence, heavy and oppressive. Crow held up a hand, signaling them to stop. Stay close. Don't let anything separate us. And if I tell you to run, you run and don't look back. They approached cautiously. The first tent they checked was empty, but signs of struggle were everywhere. Overturned cots, medical instruments scattered across the ground, and bloodstains, dark and dried. The second tent held bodies, but they'd been dead for days, not hours, already beginning to bloat and rot in the spring heat. The church itself loomed before them, its white paint peeling, its steeple tilting slightly to one side. The front doors stood open, and from within came a sound, wet, rhythmic, like someone chewing with their mouth open. Crow drew a knife from his belt, its blade inscribed with symbols similar to those James had seen on the trees. Whatever happens in there, remember, they're not people anymore. They're shells, hollow things worn by something that shouldn't exist. You're not committing murder. You're granted mercy. They entered the church. The interior was dim, sunlight filtering through stained glass windows to paint everything in shades of red and blue. The pews had been pushed aside to make room for wounded men, but now those makeshift beds were empty. Not empty, occupied by figures that sat or lay in unnatural poses, some with their backs bent backward, others with limbs twisted at impossible angles. And in the center of it all, kneeling before the altar, was something that had once been a man. It wore the remnants of a surgeon's apron, now black with dried blood. Its back was to them, but James could see that its spine pushed against its skin in sharp protrusions, as if the bones had grown too large for the flesh containing them. The wet chewing sound came from this creature. It was eating something, tearing at it with hands and teeth, and James realized with horror that it was feeding on one of the wounded, a man who might have still been alive when this started, who might have felt every moment of his consumption. In nomine Patris, Crow whispered, raising his knife. The symbols along its blade began to glow with a faint, sickly light. Et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti. The creature's head swiveled, turning a full 180 degrees, while its body remained still. Its face was a nightmare, jaw distended like a snake's, teeth filed to points, eyes replaced by empty black sockets that seemed to contain entire universes of hunger. It screamed, and the sound was every nightmare James had ever had given voice. The hollow men in the pews began to move, rising with that horrible wrong motion, converging on them from all sides. "Now!" Crow shouted and threw himself at the creature. What followed was chaos. James fired his rifle at the nearest hollow man, watched it stumble but not fall. Thomas was beside him, clubbing another with his rifle butt, trying to beat it back. The creatures moved slowly, but with terrible purpose, grabbing with grey hands that felt like ice. Crow and the surgeon thing were locked in combat before the altar, the captain's knife leaving trails of light in the air as he slashed and stabbed. The creature was faster, stronger, but Crow fought with the precision of someone who'd done this before, targeting weak points, avoiding its slashing claws. James felt hands close around his throat, cold and strong. He struggled, tried to break free, but the hollow man's grip was like iron. His vision began to darken, spots dancing before his eyes, and he thought this was it. This was how he died. Not in glory on the battlefield, but strangled by a corpse in a defiled church. A gunshot cracked, impossibly loud. The hollow man's head snapped back, and its grip loosened. Thomas had reloaded, fired point blank. "Aim for the head," he shouted. "Shoot them in the head." James gasped for air, bringing his own rifle around. He fired, saw another creature's skull explode in a spray of black ichor. It finally fell, truly dead now. They'd found the weakness. At the altar, Crow drove his knife into the surgeon thing's chest, right where a human heart would be. The symbols on the blade flared brilliant white, and the creature shrieked, its body convulsing. Cracks appeared in its flesh, light bleeding through, and then it collapsed into ash and bone, leaving nothing but a scorched outline on the floor. The remaining hollow men stopped moving. For a moment, they stood frozen. Then one by one, they crumpled to the ground. Whatever animating force had driven them now fled or destroyed. The three men stood in the silence that followed, breathing hard, covered in blood and ash. "What?" James started, then stopped, not sure what question to even ask. Crow wiped his blade clean on a pew. That was a feeder. A physical manifestation of the hunger that's infected this place. Destroying it broke the connection to the hollow men it controlled. He looked around at the carnage. There will be more, many more. The war has barely begun. Thomas sank onto a pew, hands shaking. "How do you know all this? How do you know how to fight these things?" For the first time, Crow's confident facade cracked slightly. "Because I've seen this before. Different war, different country, but the same horror. Death breeds death. Violence opens doors. I thought I could leave it behind when I came to America, start fresh. But war found me again." He met their eyes. "It always does." "What do we do now?" James asked. "Now we do what I said before. We survive, we fight, and we try to make sure that when this war finally ends, there's still a world left worth saving." Crow moved toward the door, then paused. "The official records will say this hospital was attacked by Confederate raiders. That's what the army needs to believe. But we'll know the truth, and we'll be ready for the next time." They emerged from the church into afternoon sunlight that seemed impossibly clean and normal after the darkness within. In the distance, they could hear the rumble of artillery, the war continuing, oblivious to the secret horror festering in its shadow. James looked back at the church one last time. He'd come to Tennessee to fight for the Union, to preserve the nation, to free the enslaved. He still believed in those causes, but now he understood that there was another battle being waged, one that most soldiers would never know about, against an enemy that made human cruelty seem almost merciful by comparison. The war between the states would last 4 more years, and claim 600,000 lives. But for James Hutchins, Thomas Webb, and Captain Matthias Crowe, a different war had just begun, one that would take them to every blood-soaked battlefield, every mass grave, every place where the barrier between life and death grew thin. They walked into the forest, leaving the church and its horrors behind. But James knew they'd never truly leave it behind. The memory would haunt him forever, a constant reminder that there were worse things than cannonballs and bayonets. There were things that fed on the dead, and the war was feeding them well. The heat was murderous, even at night. James Hutchins sat with his back against a stone wall on Cemetery Ridge, cleaning his rifle for the third time that day. Not because it needed it, but because idle hands gave his mind room to wander, and wandering minds in this new world of his inevitably stumbled into dark places. It had been over a year since Shiloh, a year of hunting things that shouldn't exist in the margins of the war, of learning that every battlefield birthed its own unique horrors. Captain Crowe had been right about everything. The war was a feast for the things that dwelled in shadows, and they were growing stronger. You feel it too, don't you? Thomas Webb dropped down beside him, offering a canteen. The boy, no, man now, none of them were boys anymore, had hollow circles under his eyes that no amount of sleep would cure. That wrongness in the air. James took a drink, the water tepid and tasting of metal. Ever since we arrived, this whole town feels like it's holding its breath. They'd come to Gettysburg 3 days ago, part of the defensive line preparing to meet Lee's army of Northern Virginia. The battle had started yesterday, a brutal day of fighting that left thousands dead or wounded on both sides. Today had been more of the same, wave after wave of Confederate attacks, each repulsed at terrible cost. But that wasn't what had James on edge. He'd fought in enough battles now to recognize the normal feel of warfare, the adrenaline, the fear, the exhaustion. This was something else, something watching, waiting. "Where's the captain?" Thomas asked. "Reconnaissance. Said he sensed something beneath the town. Old tunnels maybe, or natural caves." James checked his ammunition. They'd learned to carry special bullets now, iron mixed with silver, each one inscribed with protective symbols that Crowe claimed would actually work on the things they hunted. James wasn't sure about the mysticism, but he couldn't argue with results. He took Miller and Ashford with him. Private Jack Miller and Corporal David Ashford were the newest additions to their small band. Both had witnessed horrors at Chancellorsville that the official reports attributed to Confederate atrocities. Crowe knew better. Their unit now numbered 7 men. Enough to make a difference, but small enough to move unseen through the larger war. A figure emerged from the darkness, Sergeant William Hayes, another member of their group. His face was grim, even by his usual standards. "We've got a problem," Hayes said without preamble. "Word from the hospital tents. Men aren't staying dead." James was on his feet instantly. "How many?" 4 so far. That they're admitting to, probably more. The surgeons think it's some kind of fit, death-like stupor brought on by shock. They're restraining the recovered patients for observation. Hayes spat. "Fools! They have no idea what they're dealing with." The 3 of them moved quickly through the Union lines, weaving between exhausted soldiers, trying to snatch a few hours of sleep before tomorrow's fighting. The field hospital had been set up in a farm at the base of the ridge, its barn converted into a surgery, its fields filled with white tents housing the wounded. As they approached, James heard screaming, not the screams of men in pain, but something worse, terror so pure it stripped away all humanity, reducing grown men to animals fleeing a predator they couldn't comprehend. They ran the last 100 yards. The hospital was chaos. Surgeons and orderlies fleeing, patients who could walk helping those who couldn't, everyone trying to get away from the barn. From inside came sounds of violence, of flesh tearing, of bones breaking, and underneath it all, a sound James had heard before. Wet, rhythmic chewing. "Where's Crow when we need him?" Thomas muttered, loading his rifle with the special ammunition. "We can't wait," James said. "How many bullets do you have?" "6 shots. You?" "7. Hayes?" "8." The sergeant drew his pistol with one hand, a long knife with the other. "If we empty our guns and they're still coming, aim for the skull with these. We learned at Shiloh that destroying the brain severs the connection." They approached the barn carefully. The main doors had been torn off their hinges, hanging at odd angles. Inside, the surgery had been transformed into an abattoir. Bodies lay everywhere, some doctors and orderlies who hadn't escaped in time, others patients who'd been too wounded to flee. And moving among the carnage were the hollow men. These were fresher than the ones at Shiloh, killed only hours ago, and they moved faster, more deliberately. 6 of them that James could see, wearing the torn remnants of Union and Confederate uniforms. Their wounds were still visible, missing limbs, gaping chest cavities, heads partially blown away. But they moved as if whole, as if death were only a minor inconvenience. And in the center of them all, conducting this symphony of horror, stood a woman. She wore a black dress that might have been fashionable once, before it became stained with grave dirt and darker things. Her skin was pale as moonlight, her hair hanging in lank strands around a face that was beautiful and terrible in equal measure. She looked at the 3 men with eyes that held no human warmth, only a vast, aching hunger. "Soldiers," she said, her voice like winter wind through dead trees. "Have you come to add yourselves to my collection?" James raised his rifle, but she moved faster than thought, crossing the space between them in a blur. She caught the barrel, twisted it aside, and backhanded him across the barn. He hit the wall hard enough to crack wood, pain exploding through his ribs. Thomas and Hayes fired simultaneously. The bullets struck the woman's center mass, and James saw them actually hit, saw her dress tear, saw dark fluid spray. But she barely flinched. With a gesture, she sent the hollow men forward. The barn erupted into violence. James struggled to his feet, fumbling for his pistol. Hayes was locked in combat with 2 of the creatures, his knife flashing as he struck for their heads. Thomas had been borne to the ground by another, its grey hands reaching for his throat. James fired, the bullet taking the hollow man, threatening Thomas through the temple. It collapsed, truly dead. He swung toward another, fired again, miss. The creature lunged at him, and he barely dodged, feeling its fingers brush his coat. The woman watched it all with detached amusement, as if this were theater for her entertainment. "You fight well," she observed. "Better than most. You've encountered my kind before." "What are you?" James demanded, keeping his pistol trained on her even though he knew conventional bullets wouldn't stop her. "I am hunger given form. I am every mother who lost a son in this war, every widow who cursed the names of the men who took her husband. I am grief turned rancid, love soured into hate. She smiled, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too many. I am what this war creates. Hayes had killed 2 more hollow men, but a third caught him from behind, teeth sinking into his shoulder. He screamed, and James's stomach dropped. He'd seen what happened to men who were bitten. The infection spread fast, turning them into hollow men themselves within hours. "No!" James fired, hitting Hayes's attacker, giving the sergeant a chance to throw it off. But the damage was done. Blood flowed freely from the wound, already turning dark and foul. Thomas was back on his feet, firing methodically, each shot precise. Another hollow man fell, but the woman was moving again, circling them like a cat playing with mice. "You can't win," she said. "Even if you kill these puppets, I'll make more. Every man who dies in tomorrow's battle is potential material. By sunset, I'll have an army of the dead." "Not if I stop you first," the voice came from the barn door. Captain Crow stood there, his uniform torn and dirty, his knife in one hand and something else in the other. A book bound in cracked leather, its pages yellow with age. The woman's confidence flickered. "You," she hissed. "I know you. I felt you, hunting my kind, burning my children, the man who walks between worlds." "The name is Matthias Crow. And yes, I've been hunting your kind for a very long time." He opened the book, and James felt the temperature in the barn drop 10 degrees. Crow began to read in a language James didn't recognize, harsh syllables that seemed to make reality itself shudder. The woman shrieked, her beautiful facade cracking. Underneath, James glimpsed what she truly was, something skeletal and ancient, worn like a suit by an intelligence that predated humanity. She lunged at Crow, but he was ready, his knife coming up in a defensive arc. The blade met her flesh, and this time she recoiled, actual pain crossing her features. The knife's symbols blazed with the same sickly light James had seen at Shiloh, and where they touched her skin, burns appeared. Iron and silver, forged during a new moon, quenched in the blood of a willing sacrifice, Crow said calmly, still reading from the book with his other hand. Effective against spirits, demons, and things that crawl up from the dark places of the earth. Which are you, I wonder? The last hollow man collapsed as Thomas put a bullet through its brain. Now it was just the 3 of them, and Crow facing the woman. The thing in woman's shape. She was backing toward the rear of the barn, hissing like a snake. "This isn't over. The war continues. Men continue to die. My kind grows stronger every day." "Then I'll continue to hunt you," Crow replied. "Every day, every battlefield, until this war ends or I do." She laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Brave words from a dead man. "Tell me, Captain, do you really think you can save them? Any of them? This country is tearing itself apart, and the blood it's spilling will summon things that make me look like a children's bedtime story." With that, she seemed to collapse in on herself, her form dissolving into black smoke that flowed through cracks in the barn wall and was gone. Crow closed the book carefully, then turned to Hayes. The sergeant was on his knees, one hand pressed to his bleeding shoulder. Already, his skin was taking on an ashen quality. "How long do I have?" Hayes asked, his voice steady despite everything. "Hours, maybe. The infection spreads faster in those who are weakened." Crow knelt beside him. "I'm sorry, William. If I'd gotten here sooner..." "Don't. Hayes cut him off. We all knew the risks when we joined this fool's crusade of yours. He looked at James and Thomas. You two need to promise me something. When I turn, when I become one of those things, you put me down quick. No hesitation. Can you do that? Thomas looked away, but James met the sergeant's eyes. I can. I will. Good man. Hayes managed a weak smile. Reckon I always knew I'd die in this war. Just thought it'd be a rebel bullet, not this. They carried him outside, away from the charnel house of the barn. Other members of their unit, Miller and Ashford, had returned from their own reconnaissance and were helping to organize the survivors, creating a cordon around the hospital while making excuses about Confederate infiltrators to the regular army officers. Crow sat beside Hayes, and for the first time since James had met him, the captain looked old, tired, almost defeated. There are too many of them, Crow said quietly. Every battle creates more. I can fight individuals, even groups, but if what that creature said is true, if they're growing stronger, eventually they'll overwhelm us. So what do? James asked. We do what soldiers do. We fight until we can't fight anymore. Crow pulled out his journal, adding notes about the woman creature they'd encountered. This one was different from the others, more powerful, more intelligent. It could control multiple hollow men at once. That suggests a hierarchy, which means there might be something even stronger pulling the strings. A terrible thought occurred to James. The battle tomorrow. Pickett's charge. Crow looked up sharply. James had heard the rumors, the preparations. Lee was planning a massive assault on the Union Center. Thousands of men across open ground. The carnage would be unprecedented. They're counting on it, Crow said, understanding dawning in his eyes. That much death, all in one place, all at once. It would be a feast for them, enough to manifest something truly terrible. Can we stop it? Thomas asked. Stop the charge? We're just privates and a captain. We have no authority to countermand General Lee or alter battle plans. Crow stood, pacing. But we might be able to disrupt whatever ritual they're planning if we can find where they're gathering, strike before they're ready. Sir. Miller came running up, his face pale. We've found something. Underground, beneath the town. You need to see this. They followed him through the darkened streets of Gettysburg, past houses with shuttered windows and frightened residents huddled inside. The town had become a focal point of the battle, caught between two massive armies, and its civilians paid the price in terror and destruction. Miller led them to a cellar entrance in the ruins of a burned-out church. The doors had been torn open, revealing stone steps descending into blackness. Found this during our sweep, Miller explained. At first we thought it was just a storm cellar, but it goes deeper, much deeper, and there are sounds coming from below. Chanting, Crow lit a lantern and started down. The others followed, leaving Hayes behind with strict orders to call out if he started to turn. The sergeant sat with a loaded pistol in his lap, ready to do what needed to be done if it came to that. The stairs went down far longer than any cellar had a right to. The walls were old stone, older than the church above, possibly older than the town itself. Strange marks covered the surface. Not the protective symbols Crow used, but something else. Something that predated those protective wards. Native American, Crow murmured, running his fingers over the carvings. Susquehannock maybe, or an older tribe. These markings are warnings. Roughly translated, they say, place of the dead, and do not wake what sleeps below. Comforting, Thomas muttered. The stairs ended in a vast natural cavern. Stalactites hung from the ceiling like teeth, and in the center, surrounding a pit that seemed to descend into the earth's very core, stood figures in black robes. The woman from the barn was there, along with 12 others. They formed a circle around the pit, chanting in that same harsh language Crow had used earlier. But where Crow's words had been protective, defensive, these were summoning, calling. And something was answering. James could feel it. A presence vast and terrible, rising from the depths. The air grew thick, hard to breathe, and the shadows themselves seemed to darken, becoming more real, more solid. "We're too late," Crow whispered. "They've already begun the summoning. If we interrupt now, the backlash could destroy the entire town." "And if we don't?" James asked. "Then whatever they're calling up will destroy far more than that." The chanting reached a crescendo. The woman raised her arms, and James saw that she held something. A chalice filled with dark liquid that he suspected was blood. Not just any blood. This would be taken from soldiers, from men who died violent deaths in battle, their essence concentrated and distilled. She poured it into the pit. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the ground began to shake. The stalactites shattered, raining stone shards. The pit erupted with black smoke that coalesced into a shape. Something massive, something that had to crouch to fit in the cavern despite its enormous size. It had too many limbs, too many angles that hurt to look at directly. Where its face should have been was a void that sucked in light and sound and hope. James felt his mind trying to reject what he was seeing, to rationalize it into something comprehensible. But it defied comprehension. This was what lived in the darkness between life and death. This was what fed on the boundary between worlds. This was the thing that the war had summoned, and it was hungry. The robed figures prostrated themselves before it. Their chanting now turned to words of worship and submission. The woman spoke in that winter wind voice. "Great devourer, we have fed you well. Thousands have died in your name. Thousands more will fall tomorrow. Grant us your blessing. Make us your avatars, and we will ensure that this war never ends, that the dying continues until every living soul has crossed over into your domain." The creature's response was not words, but a feeling, a psychic weight that pressed down on everyone in the cavern. James felt his knees buckle, felt his mind beginning to crack under the strain of its attention. Crow grabbed him and Thomas, pulling them back toward the stairs. "We need to leave now, before it notices us." But it was too late. The creature turned, its knot face oriented toward them, and James felt its hunger focus on him specifically. His thoughts became sluggish, his limbs heavy. It was like drowning in dark water, pulled down by invisible hands. Crow did something James didn't see clearly. Threw powder, spoke words, and traced symbols. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe.